Thank you, Almut, for accepting our interview. And I will start with a fair question.
Okay.
What does the United States really want in Georgia? And can you define the strategic interests of the United States and of the European Union in Georgia?
I think fundamentally the United States wants in Georgia the same thing that it wants anywhere else in the world, and that is it wants as much dominance and control as it can get. And that is particularly interesting for the United States in countries where it feels that its adversaries, its enemies, that could be Russia, and that is also China or Iran, that might also have influence or have interests. If you're a country that is far away from all of these places, then the US may not be very interested in you either. And ironically, of course, is that the US has had far more influence and far more control and far more dominance in Georgia over the last 20, 25, almost 30 years than any of these other countries. So it has actually had a lot of control over Georgia. So I know that a lot of Georgians think that, the US or Europe might be interested in Georgia because Georgia is somehow special. Like maybe it is more attractive, more charming, maybe it has some secret potential, or maybe because they think it is located in a very strategic place of the world. But the truth is, you can say about almost any country in the world that it is in a strategic location. So Georgia is really not very special in that respect. And more recently, people have been saying, and this is something people have been saying in the Georgian opposition, but also in the Georgian Dream government, Georgia is important because there's something called the Middle Corridor. And that is the trade route from Europe to China. So you don't have to go through Russia, you don't have to go through Iran, but you can go in the middle, like through Central Asia and the South Caucasus. And maybe that is true, but the ironic thing is that right now, the US and Europe are trying to stop trading with China. Like they're trying to they call it decoupling or de-risking or friendshoring. But what they basically mean by this is they want to try it as little as possible with China. So that story about the Middle Corridor also doesn't quite explain anymore why Georgia would be of such interest to the West.
Let me move to another question, which is kind of more related to civil society organizations in Georgia and also to your experience. So considering your extensive experience work in non-governmental organizations, how would you define the motivations of the Georgian NGOs? Do they really represent this genuine civil society in Georgia in a classical sense?
I've literally worked, I did an internship when I was very young with a Georgian NGO already 23 years ago. So I've been watching the development of the Georgian NGO sector from the inside and from the outside for a long time. And I all the time keep coming back and working with Georgian NGOs, mostly small ones, on helping them, supporting them with their fundraising, for example. And so you could say that in all the post-Soviet countries, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, anywhere, NGOs, as they are commonly understood, they're not really civil society in the full sense of the definition. So civil society can be defined in different ways, right? And you and I know that, there are modern theories about what is civil society. There are theories going back to the 19th century. But all of the definitions do not really apply to the NGO sector as we see them in Georgia today. What you could say is that these NGOs, as they exist, they are a very, very narrow and very extreme form of civil society. And probably Georgia, out of all the post-Soviet countries, is the most extreme case. So the basic idea of civil society is that it's citizens coming together, they join together to help each other or to help their community, right? And that can be spontaneous or it can be long-term and organized. But typically this means this is not something you do full-time. This is not something that is your job or your career. And there are also some limitations, it should not be for profit, right? It should not have a commercial motive. And another definition is it should stay away from politics and from government. Like it should not, if you're in an NGO, like you should always be separate from government and separate from the power of the state. So there are some peculiar features of civil society in Georgia, much like in much of the rest of the former Soviet Union. And that is, first of all, that their money comes almost exclusively from abroad. This is not a normal thing. Like this is a very abnormal, globally compared, this is abnormal. Another thing that is very interesting, that is very different from the classic definition of civil society, is that most NGOs are not open to members of the public, right? You can't just knock at the door and say, hello, I want to be one of your members. Can I volunteer here? Can I give you a donation? Just like, it's not even foreseen. And there are no members, and there's also no internal democracy. It's not like there are like thousands and hundreds of members who then elect the leaders of these organizations or like the treasurer, right? It doesn't work like that. So I think NGOs can look all sorts of, like civil society can take all different forms, right? But the NGOs in Georgia are very specific, very narrow, very strange form. So for example, you could say chickens are biologically related to dinosaurs, right? And that's actually correct, genetically, technically, right? But of course, a chicken is a very strange kind of dinosaur. And you could ask yourself the question, why are there only chickens in Georgia and no dinosaurs, right? Like, why is there only this tiny, tiny, weird part of civil society, but not so much all these other forms that civil society could take? For example, why are there no large-scale volunteer firefighters? Why are there no food pantries that source food locally and distribute it to the poor? Why are there no clubs with like thousands or tens of thousands of members? Why are there no scouts, right? Like where like adults volunteer to time to engage with young people, with children.
What do you think about some critiques of the NGOs regarding that they are used as a foreign policy tools by foreign powers?
Okay, so I think 95% of that is a conspiracy theory and is not true, right? Because all of us have worked with a lot of NGOs, and if they're quite small, or most people who work in NGOs, and most NGOs just want to do their little specific thing. Like they want to work with autistic children in the school system, right? Or they want to work on cleaning up rivers in their district, right? They don't actually want to get engaged in politics. So it is not true that, sometime in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, I don't know, the CIA went around the world and created NGOs so that 20, 30 years later, you could use them in color revolutions. That is not correct. It is, however, true when you have an entire segment of the population, right? An elite, this is like the upper class, right, in terms of income. And for 20, 30 years, their income, their careers, their status, their power has entirely dependent not just on foreign money, but on having a constant conversation with foreign representatives, and particularly representatives of governments. They come to see themselves as sort of a weird sort of intermediary between the West and their own countries, their own societies. And they also feel, very often what you hear from people in these NGOs is that like, my own community, they just don't understand me. But when I go to, a reception at the embassy, they love everything I do, right? So like there's a strong psychological connection too. And so at a time like this, when there is a political crisis, that is true, that some Western donors, some governments, but also private foundations, they like the idea that they could use this moment to support their friends and allies, but also maybe to to extend their control over, the change that is happening in that country. And sometimes they do that because they feel it would be a good thing. Maybe they think like, oh, if only we could have a little more influence in Georgia, we could do more for women's rights there, right? Or we could do more for minority children. And so they think that would be a good thing for them to gain more influence. And so at a moment like this, of a political crisis, of unrest, they may give additional resources to their friends and partners so they can maybe not participate in protests, but maybe protect themselves from the fallout of protests, or but they're certainly encouraged. So it's a very complicated picture, and it is not the conspiracy theory that some people believe it is.
Now let's move to the political processes which are happening now in Georgia. Do you see any similarities between the current protests in Georgia and Maidan? So, because there are many experts who say that there are some similarities between those events.
Well, I mean, there are obviously similarities. I have to say that I did actually work in Ukraine. I started working in Ukraine a lot soon after the Maidan, and a lot of my colleagues and friends in Ukraine were on the Maidan. And then some of my colleagues and friends in Ukraine were also watching what happened on the Maidan, and they said, this is bad things will start happening in our country. And that is why they became activists, to help prevent some of the violent consequences. So I can compare it pretty well. And so the superficial similarities is people out in the streets, they want to get rid of the government, and they wrap themselves in an EU flag. And another similarity would be that sort of not maybe the cause or the origin of this discontent, but just the switch, right? The switch is something having to do with the EU. In the Euromaidan in fall 2013 in Ukraine, it was Yanukovych's decision not to sign the EU association agreement, the one that in Georgia was signed at that time by Georgian Dream. And in Georgia in fall 2024, winter 2024, it is the announcement by the Georgian government that they would do something very minor and insignificant, right? Almost silly. They said, we will not put the start of accession negotiations with the EU on the agenda from our side. If the EU wants to put it on the agenda, they're welcome, they can do it. I still don't understand why they would make such an unforced mistake. It was really pointless statement. But so that was the trigger, both in Ukraine and in Georgia, that was a trigger. I think in both places, there's maybe another similarity is that people associate with the EU something far too big, something quite irrational, like the solution of all their problems and the salvation and redemption of their long-suffering country. I am a citizen of the EU, and I remember when my country, Austria, became a member of the EU, I was too young to vote for it, but I was following it and I was very excited. I remember that process. And it was completely different from what is going on in Georgia right now. And as an EU citizen, I feel very nervous that people in Ukraine and Georgia expect so much of the EU, because the EU cannot actually do these things for them. It cannot. And another thing, I always joke with friends, I say the worst thing that could happen to the EU's reputation in Georgia would be if tomorrow Georgia becomes a member of the EU and everybody realizes that actually, no, their dreams didn't come true, their problems weren't addressed, and actually the EU cannot do these things. It is not meant to do these things for them. So these are the similarities, but there are also big differences. And I think a critical difference is that, these are just very different countries. Ukraine is very large and had a great many different and very powerful political camps. That doesn't exist like this in Georgia. Ukraine in 2013 and to this day is a very corrupt country. Georgia is actually not. Georgia has made, out of the post-Soviet countries, probably the greatest progress towards transforming corruption or eliminating corruption. Another difference would be that Ukraine wasn't just politically polarized. Georgia is also politically polarized, obviously, but Ukraine is also geographically polarized. It is true that culturally and politically, the different regions of Ukraine have very different ideas of what their country should be like. And that is not the case in Georgia. So very important differences is that we saw in these protests that started after November 28th, we saw in the first week or 10 days a very significant sort of explosion of violence. And that violence was committed by a very small group of people and a very distinct group of people. That wasn't all the protesters. Like a lot of people went to the protests, didn't even know that there was violence there. And then they came home and they saw that, on TV or whatever, that there was violence and they were shocked by it. So there was a little bit of well-organized but very well-defined violence in Georgia. And then it was switched off, right? Like there were some arrests and then it stopped. And the last 2 weeks, there's actually not been any of the violence that we've seen in the first 2 weeks. So that is very interesting. In Ukraine in 2013, and obviously today, much more so, there were always very large informal groups of people who were ready and willing to deploy organized violence. You could almost call them paramilitaries. You could call them organized crime. Some of them were just football ultras, but they had like a job, like their job was to work as like bodyguards for oligarchs. So they were trained and able to project violence. Nothing like this exists in Georgia, thank God. And I think it's an important difference.
There is new president of the United States, President Trump, elected, and there is expectation that there will be a big shift in foreign policy of the United States, specifically with regards to Russia-Ukrainian war. And so President Trump promised that he will end Russia-Ukrainian war in 24 hours. So this is a kind of a source of those expectations. And also there is a discussion that Ukraine may not join the NATO, and there could be other sort of security guarantees for the Ukraine. And so how would you evaluate the Ukraine's chances in this context of joining NATO? And actually there is also a second question related to this. If the United States were to abandon Ukraine, its promise, its pledge regarding the joining of NATO, what would Georgia's kind of new security architecture look like in this context? Because Georgia and Ukraine are very linked in this kind of endeavor.
Well, that's actually a lot of questions. So let's start with Trump. I've already said at the beginning that a lot of Georgians have a somewhat inflated opinion of how important their country is in the world. And in a way, it is true. It is interesting that it's such a small country, a poor country, and yet, the international media pays a lot of attention. So like the country gets a lot more attention than makes sense, which is interesting. That said, I am not sure President Trump even really fully knows your country exists. There's another Georgia in the US, and he's very obsessed with that Georgia because he had problems in the 2020 elections there. And I think he thinks about that a lot. I don't think he thinks a lot about your Georgia. I think around the world, a lot of people, and in the US, a lot of people are expecting radical change from the Trump administration, and some of them are afraid, some of them are hoping. And I think those who are hoping will be, many of them, disappointed, and those who are afraid will be relieved, because it is unlikely that he will implement all of the radical changes that he has promised or talked about. Or he may not even have talked about himself, but people who, like in the US, like in the foreign policy elites, have said things that he will do, promised things, dreamed up scenarios that he will do. And it's not clear whether he will do them at all. So I would say that it's more interesting to look at who are the people he has hired to run his foreign policy. And there the picture is actually really contradictory. So he has hired people who have very different views from the usual American foreign policy establishment, who really want to, pull back from the rest of the world, really want to pull back from NATO, want to, end the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible, would prefer to be peace, anywhere and not to get involved. And then there are other people in that administration too that actually generally like it when the US goes to war somewhere, when the US expands its alliances, and who want to strengthen NATO. So it's hard to say what this will actually look like. I did actually, as it happens, he gave a press conference last night, and I listened to it, and he did talk about Ukraine and Russia, and I do think that may be one of his top priorities. Like, this is something that he does actually think a lot about himself, and that is close to his own political goals. So I do think he will try to bring about negotiations as soon as he officially can, which is January 20th. Before then, he can't even have like a lot of conversations. He can have some conversations and meetings, but by law, he's not allowed to take a lot of big steps yet. So it's obviously not going to be 24 hours. And I think it's also important, all of us, those of us who've worked on peace and conflict, right? And those of us who've studied peace and conflict, and especially who have like studied peace processes, like how do we get from violent conflict of war towards peace? We all know that these processes can take a very long time. They can take years. And we also know that very often when we look at typical peace processes, they fail several times before they succeed, right? And it's very good to remind ourselves of that. So whatever Trump does after January 20th, even if his best people, and even if people with it who are competent and want to really bring about peace, even if they do their best, it can fail a few times before it succeeds. And we should be patient, and we should remind ourselves of that. What is it? So what about NATO? Well, I'm one of these people, there are some experts, and I agree with them, who say that Ukraine cannot be part of NATO for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that, okay, so some people say Russia attacked Ukraine because he wants to, rebuild the Soviet Union. I don't believe that. I think the idea that NATO would expand into Ukraine was actually the far greater motivation. And of course, the NATO stands here for US military interests and control. So Russia will it is unlikely that Russia will agree to a peace deal that leaves open the chance that Ukraine will join NATO. And it doesn't matter if they say, well, maybe not in 10 years, maybe only in 20 years, it doesn't matter. Like, that is not acceptable to Russia. So I don't see how currently this could be part of a peace deal. Also because right now, Russia is not under a lot of pressure militarily. So they can ask for more than the other side, just the way things are. The other reason I think, and I think this is very interesting, is that there is a real sort of paradox, like a catch-22 at this idea, right? And so basically NATO is a defensive alliance, and a defensive alliance is both a promise and a threat. To its members, it promises, if somebody attacks you, all of us will defend you. And to its enemies, it says, if you attack any one of us, we will all go fight you. And we will fight you with our own militaries. And if they are a nuclear power, we risk our own cities, the safety and survival of our own cities, to protect our one alliance partner. So you could call it a promise, you could call this a threat, but you could also call it a bluff, right? Because you can never really be sure, are they actually going to do that, right? In the entire history of NATO, there's never been a situation where NATO actually had to defend one of its members. The only exception was in Afghanistan, when the US invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, and the other members said, can we please also be part of this? And they said, okay, fine. But there was never a classical case of actually having to defend other NATO members. So it's a bluff. We don't know what would happen. However, we do know that NATO has been around for a long time, more than 70 years. And many times have some of the members asked themselves the question, would you, the US, with your nuclear weapons, would you risk Washington, D.C. or New York to protect Paris or Berlin? Would you risk it to protect Tallinn? Would you risk it to protect Kiev? And some, like the French government already in the 50s and 60s, didn't believe it. It basically said, we do not believe that you would risk Washington or New York for Paris. So they got their own nuclear weapons. And they even like left the military part of NATO for many, many years because of that. And right now, we have a situation where Russia is waging a war against Ukraine. Russia attacked illegally Ukraine. If NATO, if any country around the world wanted to fight on the side of Ukraine, they would have every right to do so. International law allows them to help another country defend itself. So right now, all of NATO, the US, could join Ukraine and fight the war together with them. And they haven't done that. And whenever there's a question like, should we send them this kind of weapon or maybe an even stronger or more sort of dangerous kind of weapon, there's a big debate like, should we risk that? And I think all of this shows that NATO does not want to risk its own safety and the safety of its countries and its cities and their survival for Ukraine. I think that question is quite clear. So even if Ukraine joined NATO tomorrow, would you believe that bluff? I don't know if I could. I don't know if I could if I was Ukrainian. I don't know if I would if I was Russian. So that is why I think that the question of NATO in a way is now, it's almost like theoretical. It's moot. And still, it is one of the reasons why we cannot start peace negotiations. So it is actually, you could say it's a question that's only theoretical, but because of this theoretical question, every day people are being killed.
Thank you so much, Almut. It was really interesting, and thanks for your insights.